in the midst of fighting with the kicker lever, I had a sneaking suspicion. It felt like it had plenty of compression, but I had a sneaking suspicion that it had too much valve play, needed a valve adjustment. So, if it'll focus here. There we go. That, way too frickin' much valve play. Way too much. This one, way too frickin' much valve play. With that said, that means that the valves aren't opening hardly diddly each stroke. So, I'm going to go into how to adjust the valves on one of these suckers. So, doing the valve adjustment on this thing, I just looked it up. The correct valve clearance is supposed to be 2/1000ths of an inch, or 0.05 millimeters. So, just for fun, I took the biggest feeler gauge I had, which is 30 thousandths, and she slides right underneath there with lots of room to spare. So that tells you something. The valve adjustment is way freaking off on this thing. Let's see if I can get it underneath this exhaust one here. Yep, no problem at all going underneath the exhaust. Lots of room to spare still. So our valves are way misadjusted. So I'll give you a little tutorial on how to do that. Alright, there's a good spot for the camera to hang. So, to do a valve adjustment on one of these little XR80s, you'll need a 9mm, and that's what releases the jam nut. So, we're going to go ahead and just release that. And same with this side, just pop that loose. And we got to go a long ways. I don't even know if we can. We'll see. And you're supposed to have like a 2mm wrench for these. Yeah, right. Who even freaking has one of those? Not this guy. So, if you actually back these off almost all the way. There we go. Just take it off. You can actually spin those adjusting screws in by hand. Hopefully, there's enough room on there that we can still use the jam nut. Alright, what do I do with my feeler gauge? Okay, so now I got my take my 2/1000ths feeler gauge. I actually don't have a 2/1000ths in my set because it's obviously gotten used and broken and lost or something. But I have a 1/1000ths of an inch. There it is. And I'm just going to fold it in half. Use what you got. So, as long as we get both layers of this 1/1000ths feeler gauge in there, we'll be in business. Okay, so you need small fingers. You need to make sure that both pieces of that feeler gauge stay in there. And we just got to snug it up by hand. Just till it's snug and it's difficult to pull out that feeler gauge. Okay, now is where things get a little trickier, because we got to back that off just, a 1/16 of a turn, not hardly. Hopefully I can do this while still having the camera here. You need to hold the stud in place with your 1.5mm, whatever that is. You gotta take your 9mm and you gotta cinch down the jam nut. And if you do that right, you should be able to just barely pull that out again. Okay, so that's the intake. Intake's done. Now for the exhaust side. You still see that? Yep, we're still in the frame. Great. Okay, so take our 2/1000ths feeler gauge and slide under there. Come on, slide under. There we go. Get it underneath there. And get it just where it's touching. Alright, now, once again, this one actually has a little more room, but I gotta climb around my camera. I forgot the nut. Gotta put the nut on. Slip the nut back on. Okay, now take your, I believe it's 2 millimeters. I mean, it's seriously like tiny little guy here, who actually has a 2 millimeter wrench in their socket set. Nobody. Okay, now if I did that right, that might be a little tight. That's where we want that. So if I did that right, yep, we pull that feeler gauge back out. That should be it for the valve adjustment. Now we can just throw the valve cover back on. Make sure it's good and clean again still. I cleaned it off before I removed it, but you know how that goes. Alright, so we set that on there, and we just have 2 long bolts. They're kind of funny looking, because they keep these little rubber grommets on them. But they have this little lip on the bolt, so it can't fall off. And there's just 2 of them on this particular bike. And they're exactly the same, so there's not like a left and a right or a front and a back or anything. But you do need, you can't get a ratchet in here because it hits the frame. So you have to use either an open-ended or a boxed end wrench. I like to use my little ratcheting box end here. Again, this is just going into aluminum, and it has rubber gaskets and grommets. Doesn't have to be crazy tight. I think the actual like torque spec on these is some ridiculous like inch-pounds number, because you're just tightening down those rubber grommets and gaskets. That's it. And we're done with the valve adjustment. Now we just gotta put the tank back on. If you can't take the tank off, then you're probably watching the wrong channel. It's got 2 bolts, one here, one there, and then the rubber doohickey on the back that holds it down. That's it. There's not much to take in the tank off.